So today we're doing something a little bit different. I just read The Catcher in the Rye for the first time. This video is actually going to be a book review slash book talk for a class I'm taking. So for those of you who usually watch my book videos and my videos in general, this video is going to feel a little bit different. For instance, there are a few topics that I need to discuss for the sake of my class, and I'm going to talk about those first and then get to my general thoughts, feelings, and opinions on the book at the end of the video. So the first part of this video will be a pretty academic analysis of this book. I first want to start by saying that I had a lot of conversations with people about this book during my time reading it. It's a classic and it's a pretty popular novel, and when you read it in public, people tend to want to start up a conversation with you about it. The most common thing people said about it was, it wasn't my favorite. Which, first of all, scared me. And second of all, I think is so interesting because I feel like so many people do say that this is their favorite novel. I'm going to start with an analysis of the literary techniques and literary elements used in this book. The first one being, of course, character. When I was talking to people about this book, a lot of people said that they didn't really like Holden Caulfield, the main character, and I was torn myself for a long time. But in the end, I liked Holden. You know, I didn't hate him. Even though he's hard to like, I kind of think that that's symbolic or a metaphor for how we feel about our younger selves, or how we feel about ourselves. Like, it's hard to like yourself, it's hard to like your younger self, and it's hard to look back and see who you used to be and like that person. Hindsight's always 20/20, and you always criticize the person that you used to be. I think that's what Holden's character challenges the readers to do. Look inward on themselves and kind of see the hard parts of themselves that they might not want to look at. He has some really beautiful, insightful, and symbolic things to say about the world, and I loved that, and I loved his perspective. The second literary element that I would like to talk about is setting. The New York City setting, I think it definitely lent itself to his sort of journey inward and outward, because New York City is just, you can walk everywhere and you can just roam around. And I think the time period is also really important as well. Like, in the 50s, things were a lot different. Kids could walk around the city by themselves, whereas nowadays you would not let a 14-year-old run around New York City by themselves. And in that way, the setting is very, very different, but I think the reason this book is considered so universal is that even though the time period is different and the language is different and what people could do is different, the expectations that are put on teenagers and young people in general remains the same. And that's why I think people still today love this book. The next element is conflict. While most of the conflict in this book is pretty internal, there is that conflict of parents, which is a pretty universal theme when you're young. Like, the biggest thing you have to deal with is your parents, or adults in general. Even though he has been kicked out of school, that's the premise of this book. He's been kicked out of school. He's not supposed to go home until a certain date. He just ditches school anyway and leaves. And so his conflict is kind of self-made, but I think that's true of a lot of teenagers not knowing what to do. They kind of create problems for themselves. The next topic is a very big one and a very daunting one, and that's dialogue and language. So I think the most important thing that needs to happen in a young adult novel for it to be successful, and by successful I mean that young people actually like and relate to it, is that the language in the novel used by the main characters mirrors the language that is used by the young person themselves. And even though young people in modern times of today said that the language bothered them, it doesn't really matter. Because this book came out in 1951, it honestly only needed to be relatable in terms of language to the people of that time. Language is so difficult because it's always growing and changing. It's constantly evolving. There's no way to get it right. Even though you do read this and you know that it's from the past, from the 1950s, a lot of the language that Holden used can be easily translated into modern terminology. Like, it's understandable what he was trying to say. One example that I noticed a lot was that he would say, "It scared hell out of me," instead of saying, "It scared the hell out of me." That missing word was often glaring, but I knew what he meant. So it didn't really take away from the book, but it was noticeable. The next thing I want to talk about is swearing. It's so interesting to me because as a writer, someone who goes to writing groups, something that's often talked about is not overusing obscene language. And it wasn't overused in this book, but it was definitely used. But I think the way that J.D. Salinger used it, by using words like goddamn and hell, bullshit, those were the words that he used the most, and then fuck you was only used 2 or 3 times when he was making a point. That goes to show that being careful careful with language can help you to prove a point. Which I thought was really interesting, and I definitely took note of that. That he hardly ever used the F word, I think not at all, until the very end when he's talking about how he sees the words "fuck you" written on the walls everywhere he goes, and that's a really big anxious moment for Holden and the reader, because you're feeling like there's nowhere he can go, no place is safe, nothing is going to be okay, what's he gonna do? And that was just language, that was the use of language. I also think that the use of, obscenities is interesting in young adult literature, because when you're growing up, you're constantly, and especially when you're in the young adult age of teenage years, you're testing the waters constantly. You're trying to figure out what you can and can't do, and language is definitely a part of that. Your parents tell you not to swear, people are always telling you not to say the F word, and using that language is a way of rebellion. Even though he constantly wants to run away, and is always talking about that, and in the end can't do it, I think his use of language is another form of rebellion. But that could very well be an overanalyzation. And lastly, you can't talk about language in The Catcher in the Rye without talking about Holden's use of the word phony. I think that this word bothered a lot of people, mostly because it's overused, and it kind of did for me too, until I started thinking about it in more modern terms. I started thinking about Holden Caulfield as like the original hipster. He hates everything that everyone else likes, he thinks that he likes stuff that no one else cares about, and he thinks he's special for it. He hates most everyone, and he really criticizes people for being phony and unoriginal and unintelligent. So that kind of helped me relate to Holden a little bit more. But I think that in the end, and this is only something that I can speculate about, I think that his use of the word phony and his hatred of everyone else is really him expressing this fear that, crap, I see how phony everyone is and how few people are actually authentic. What does this mean for me? What does this mean for my future? What is the world gonna do to me? I think that's just him expressing fear. He's afraid of what the world is gonna do to him, so he kind of lashes out at everyone else. I think the part that I almost cried at was it starts raining when he's at the zoo with Phoebe, and he says, "My hunting hat really gave me quite a lot of protection in a way, but I got soaked anyway." And to me that's so symbolic of how his whole front, his whole I'm unique, I'm original, everyone else is phonies. His hat is symbolic of that entire facade. He says, it gave me a lot of protection in a way, but I got soaked anyway. Like, this whole front protected me for a while, but it doesn't protect me completely. I liked Holden the best when the kind of language that he really clings to fell by the wayside, and it was really just his deepest, most vulnerable thoughts and feelings coming out. So now I want to talk about a few more general topics, the first of which is rites of passage. So Holden has quite a few rites of passage in this book. I feel like the biggest one that I noticed was alcohol. He is always after it, and I gotta give him props because he keeps trying. He never stops, and he never feels embarrassed about it, but I think that's a very typical young adult teenage thing, is to always be after alcohol for some reason, because it's forbidden and whatever. Also, girls and sex is a very big deal to Holden. There's this pressure to have done it, and done it well, and done it frequently, and I think Holden definitely experiences this and feels this pressure and sees people that have done it and he knows they've done it, but also sees the other side of people who are just lying. He criticizes them for having lied about it, but he himself lies about it because he's not gonna not lie about it. It is interesting as a female to read from that perspective, because it's something I've only really heard about. The next one is impact of cultural differences. So I'm going to take it in terms of impact of cultural differences on the reader. Someone who's sitting here in 2016, 20 years old, reading this book for the first time, you definitely see the cultural differences like I talked about in language, but it doesn't take away from the novel. There's definitely an understanding that this is from the past and that times were different, but if anything, I think that it strengthened the theme of the story. Even though it's in a different time, the feeling of the book, just the feeling of being young and having no idea what you're doing and just feeling this pressure was universal, and it came through despite kind of the cultural gap. So the next one is the interplay of the child protagonists with the world of adults. He interacted with the world of adults so much, and I think that's something that young adult literature nowadays stories is missing. It's just these young people going off, doing whatever they want, and the ones that actually include adults and parents are praised for it, when this is something that should constantly be prevalent in young adult literature, because it's something that young people face all the time. How to navigate the world of adults as a young person who isn't really respected, is trying to come into their own, and is trying to learn from these adults, but is often shut down. You see some of that with Holden at the beginning, with his teacher Spencer, Mr. Spencer. Like, he's open and he's good and he's a good guy to an extent, but then there comes a certain point when he just starts spouting the same old kind of adult rhetoric that in turn makes Holden shut down and stop listening, because he's heard it all before and he wants someone to actually listen to him and have a conversation. There's like one teacher that actually listens to him. Mr. Antolini. Mr. Antolini is the typical greatest teacher in the school. He's always there for the students. He's the one who picks up the kid's body after he jumps out a window. He's also a predator. And this is a huge moment for Holden when he wakes up and finds Mr. Antolini patting his head, and then his resulting confusion after he leaves, where he's like, well, he's a good guy. He picked up James Castle off the sidewalk and put his coat over him and didn't care if his coat got bloody. Maybe I was overreacting. How could he be a bad person if he did that? Something that J.D. Salinger did very, very well was show the tension between a young adult person and the adult world. You're told to trust adults and you're told to believe in them and believe the best of them, but throughout the entire novel, Holden is seeing the not great parts of the adult world and is trying to navigate that tension and trying to understand it. So the next one is experiences with death and dying, and I think that this is something that every young adult person experiences in their young adult life that changes them. Holden has the death of his brother, Allie. He kind of criticizes his mother for not being over it, but he's not over it. You know, when things get tough in the book at the very end, he talks to him. One of the most beautiful parts of the book had to do with this, when Phoebe was criticizing Holden for not liking anything and was kind of like worried about it. Like, you don't like anything. Holden, like, prove to me that you like something or someone. And he said, well, I like Allie. And she said, Allie's dead. That doesn't count. He kind of argues with her and says, well, yeah, it does count. Just because he's dead, I can still like him. That's very, I don't know, significant and important. Lastly is identity development. I think that this happens throughout the entire book, as Holden is constantly trying to basically run away from his problems and just call everyone a phony and say that the problem is with the world, not me. And, you know, by the end, he finally accepts that this is his situation. Stuff is not good, but he is going to choose to deal with it. I think, honestly, a lot of his development and his growth as a character has to do with his relationship with Phoebe, his sister. I think that Phoebe made him want to be a better person, and also made him a better person by extent. In the end, he says, I'm not gonna run away, I'm not gonna run away, just to kind of get her to shut up. And then he realizes in doing that, that that's not the answer, and he shouldn't run away. I think his growth is tumultuous. You can't say that you're your own person just by saying that you're not them. And that's what he does for a good portion of the book. I would say probably the first half, until he starts to stand on his own. I think the biggest indicator that he did grow as a human being are the last two lines. Don't ever tell anybody anything. If you do, you start missing everybody. I think he had to tell this story and tell about everything he had seen, everything he had experienced, in order to see them more clearly and see himself more clearly and grow as a person as a result. The last piece of this assignment is to talk about why and how this book was relatable to young adult readers. And I think the only way I can do that properly is by saying why I liked it and found it relatable. So I'm gonna read through some of my notes. The biggest thing I would like to say about this book, and I don't know if it's just me, I thought this book was really funny, and I don't know if I was supposed to. Maybe it's my sick, weird sense of humor, but I laughed at a lot of things. The line, anyway, I kept walking around the room, waiting for this prostitute to show up. I wrote, 10 out of 10, aren't we all? And this is definitely my sense of humor. No one else thinks this is funny. I thought this was really funny. We horsed around a little bit in the cab on the way over to the theater. At first she didn't want to, because she had her lipstick on and all, but I was being seductive as hell and she didn't have any alternative. Sure you were, Holden. He calls someone a fat-ass phony. I like that. So in the end, as someone who just read Catcher in the Rye for the first time at 20 years old, I enjoyed it. To quote some of the people that I spoke to while reading this book, I agree, it wasn't my favorite, but I think it could have been. But at the end of the day, I can totally see how this is so many people's favorite book, and in fact, I think that if I read it when I was a little younger, it might have been one of my favorites. That's all for this video. I hope you liked it. Thank you for watching.